Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Tying It All Together ROMA Next Generation webinar. I'm Jovita, your moderator. Today's webinar on ROMA Next Generation will be presented by Jenae Bjelland, Executive Director of NASCSP, Jenae Bjelland, Director of the Office of Community Services, Rae Tamblyn, Research and Communications Analyst with NASCSP, Kate Blunt, Senior Consultant with the Office of Community Services and NASCSP, Jarl Crocker, Director of Training and Technical Assistance with the Community Action Partnership, and Cashin Yu, Program Associate with the Community Action Partnership. Before we begin, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items. All attendees are on mute. If you have questions during the webinar, as you are aware, you can ask those questions using the chat option on the webinar toolbar. The toolbar is located on the right-hand side of your screen, and there you'll see a text box where you can type a question for all panelists. Questions will be read aloud and answered during the Q&A portions of the webinar. When typing your questions, please identify the topic and/or slide your question relates to, as well as the panelist you'd like to have respond. In order to keep to our schedule, if we don't have time for all questions, per usual, we will be compiling your questions into a FAQ following the webinar. These webinars are being recorded and will be posted to the NASCSP website. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Jenae Bjelland.
Thanks, Jovita. Welcome, everybody. So this is our webinar on tying it all together. At this point in the initial comment period, you have been getting a lot of information about what's going on with the theory of change, what we're doing with CSBG expenditures, our resources, our demographic information, and our MPIs. And now we want to talk about how they all fit. So this webinar, we're going to be covering those topics. But to quickly review, it is absolutely essential that we get your feedback on this process. That the CSBGIS was created as a voluntary system by the network for the network, and that we want this ROMA Next Generation to be the same process. That this is your data and that it should be useful for you. So this is your time to really voice your opinions and let us know what works, and if it doesn't work, let us know how we can modify it. That we really want to ensure that we have a very strong story to tell about the CSBG network, but that this is not seen as just another reporting tool. And I think that's what we've been dealing with these past few years with the national performance indicators, is that people haven't been really using them to tell the full story. So we want to ensure that ROMA Next Generation builds upon the ROMA Foundation, and that it's really about results-oriented management and accountability, that you're using this data throughout the whole cycle, through your planning, through your analysis, through your reporting, and then starting again with the planning. So we want ROMA to really help move the CSBG network forward for the next 5 to 10 years. This cannot happen overnight. That any kind of change to a system to this magnitude is going to take time to implement, which is why, as you've previously heard and seen on our website, we're not expecting that any changes that will occur that will automatically occur at the state and local level. That we know that once we get the OMB clearance and that we know what the data points are, that you all are going to have to look at your own systems and make those kinds of modifications. So we know that there's going to be some training and technical assistance level that we need on disseminating this information, some time to really provide some research on what this is going to take with IT systems, but it really does need to occur because we want CSBG to be really thought about in the nation as the lead anti-poverty network that we really are. And we need to be able to show what our results are to be able to talk about that. So what ROMA Next Generation, where we really want to be, it's the same where we wanted with ROMA, but a little bit more. That we don't want this to just be a reporting system, that we want the Federal Office of Community Services, states, local agencies, regional offices to be able to use the data that we collect as not just an administrative burden that takes the time away from your individuals and families, but really helps you make those decision-making practices. Some of the best implementations that we've seen with ROMA in local agencies is where ROMA is understood from the intake staff all the way to the executive director to the board, the tripartite board members, to show what impact your community action agency is having on the lives of the individuals and families that you're serving and your communities. So we want to be able to use this performance data to achieve greater stability and economic security, to be able to make those tough choices on what funds to go after, and to be able to show those successes and really talk about the strengths that the Community Action Network has. So tying it all together, when we really started to have this conversation, we realized that we needed to have a theory of change, and that the theory of change needed to be a visual roadmap of what we really were talking about with all of the data that we were collecting, with what it really means to be a national community action network. So we started with the foundation, that we're a national network of over 1,000 high-performing community action agencies, state associations, state offices, and federal partners, supported by the Community Services Block Grant. We know that CSBG is not a funding source, that we have typical individuals and families going to our network to say we need CSBG services, that it's the lifeblood that helps keep us all together, that it helps us be able to do the community needs assessment, to be able to do that analysis on what we really need to be able to provide at our local level. And that's the beauty of the block grant. The difficulty with the block grant is that trying to tell that story at the national level when you have all local agencies choosing their own measures can be very difficult and challenging. So that's why we looked at this theory of change, and we wanted to see, okay, we have our foundation of who we are, but then what are our core action principles? So we recognize that there's a complexity around poverty issues, and that something that's going to work in a rural area may not work in an urban area, but that both methods are really needed. And so it's what those local solutions are. But we also had to have the resources to be able to engage this. And we wanted to keep that core intent of CSBG, that maximum feasible participation with people with low income, as well as being able to strengthen our agencies by leveraging the state, federal accountability measures and the resources that we have available. So those are the core actions that we have. Then on the other side, we have our performance management. So we have to ask ourselves questions. How well does this network operate? We've known that we've been a really wonderful network for long, but how do we really talk about that? So the Office of Community Services really took that on as a challenge to develop their performance management framework and release the organizational standards. These organizational standards have been wonderful for us to be able to talk about the strengths and the value of community action. They've been great tools for us to talk about CSBG on the Hill. Now we're also having a state and federal accountability measures because we need to ensure that we have this built at every single level. And we've always had ROMA, our Results-Oriented Management Accountability System, that encompasses all of this. Then we also need to talk about what difference does the network make. When we talk about how well we operate, we also need to talk about the difference. So what are our robust results? We developed the National Performance Indicators about 10 years ago so that we could really have a way of gauging what was happening with the Community Services Network, and that we looked at that from the individuals and family side as well as the community side because those are all of our impacts. When we were having these discussions about ROMA Next Generation, we realized that there was a missing component with the CSBGIS, and that is that we really didn't have a way of successfully telling what services and strategies local agencies and states were using. That some of the services and strategies were mixed in with national performance indicators, but they really weren't outcomes. So that's our next level here, is that we have our services and strategies. Now these are just representations of services and strategies. They're not all of them, but we have health, we have housing, we have employment, we have policy changes, we have community development and partnerships. This is everything that we try to work together to tie our when we have people come in to receive services, when we decide what we're going to do in our community, what are the services and impacts we're going to have that are going to lead to the outcomes. And at the very top, we have our national goals. That we had started with ROMA with 6 national goals. And as the group started to talk about this, we wanted to refine those goals. So now we have individuals and families with low income are stable and achieve economic security as goal 1. Communities where people with low incomes live are healthy and offer economic opportunity is another. And then people with low income are engaged and active in building opportunities in communities. So these new national goals we felt were more realistic about the understanding of how we are working within our organizations, within our network, that we wanted to really strengthen the idea that this is about individuals and families, this is about communities, and this is about our impact. And then we wanted to ensure that we had the clarity about who we were as it relates to CSBG funding and other resources that are leveraged by local agencies. So this is the core concept of what we're going to be talking about today. We have been releasing a lot of this information as components. So we have our fiscal components, we have our demographics, we have our NPIs. But this is for you to be able to look at it as it relates back to the CSBGIS, but know that all of these have to be tied together. That for you to be able to tell your full story, you need to be able to not only identify the individuals and families who come into your agency to receive services, but how you serve them, what funding helps support them, what services you provide to them, and what outcomes does that lead to. So now I'm going to turn it over to Rae to talk about expenditures and agency capacity.
Thanks, Jenae. Hello, everyone on the webinar. For those of you who don't know me, this is Rae Tamblyn, Research and Communications Analyst at NASCSP. And before we dive into the actual reporting forms, I want to reiterate that particularly for the resources and the agency capacity and expenditures reports, these are not new. There is very few pieces within these revised reports that are completely new. So as I go through these reporting forms, I'll be sure to point out which pieces are currently being reported on in the CSBGIS. And our hope is that you'll see that this is not a reinvention of the wheel, but rather a refining of the wheel. So if we look at the CSBG Expenditures and Agency Capacity Report, many of these domains appear familiar to the way that you currently report the CSBG funding as in the current CSBGIS. So as to reiterate, this is again the total amount of CSBG funding expended during the fiscal year for services strategies and the new element of agency capacity. Now, resources, which I'll talk about in just a second, is the total agency's operating budget. But we also want a way to be able to say where CSBG funding is being spent, because we know that this looks different at a national, a state, and a local level, because this is a flexible block grant. And so we want to be able to say at a national level where the target areas are on down through the network. So what is the national picture of where our CSBG money is focused? Where is this money focused at a state level, and where is this focused by agencies? And this is, many of you will be familiar with these, as these are the pieces that you would be proposing to the state in your community action plan and deciding your priorities in your community needs assessment prior to the beginning of the funding year. So that being said, many of these, as I mentioned, reflect our domains: employment, education and cognitive development, housing, etc. I do want to make a specific note that we have refined and expanded some of the categories that did not necessarily show the full community action story as it could have been. So, for example, we have broken out emergency services and expanded the meaning of other. So we understand that disaster does count as an emergency service, but it is a distinct category of emergency. So we want to be able to say where the disaster relief is being spent as opposed to your overall emergency services. We've also added the coordinated service delivery for things like case management, coaching, and counseling, which are sort of those broad, multi-spanning domain-focused elements that often may touch on several of these domains. And so we wanted to really make sure that we offer the network the opportunity to report these multi-domain focused efforts within this new proposed CSBG expenditures report. We have also added administration back into the table. For those of you who are familiar with CSBGIS, we asked the monies to be reported in a singular table and then to pull the administration out. And we've added this into your total CSBG expenditure for the year, with the understanding that our definition of administration may be different than other funding sources, and there is a link on this reporting form as well as on the PDFs that you can download from ROMA Next Generation on the website to IM37, which has more detailed information, which will continue to ring true for the network with regards to your reporting. And I do want to also note that the uniform guidance and the super circular will continue to be your current standard as well. So these are different categories of reporting, but the current guidance on reporting these funding categories will remain the same. Agency capacity, however, we have added a whole new table under agency capacity funded by CSBG. And before I dive into the report, I really want to reiterate the fact that all of these elements, you will see them reflected in the theory of change. So if you just look briefly at this reporting form, you will see community needs assessment, strategic planning, data management, training and technical assistance, and other on table number 2, number 1, with activities that were funded by CSBG under agency capacity. And I would draw your attention on the theory of change to both that foundational piece with the national network of over 1,000 high-performing community action agencies, and also our core principles. So we are deeply engaged in maximizing the involvement of people with low income and leveraging the resources that we have and building strong, high-performing agencies. So again, for those who are familiar with the current CSBG IS, you will see many of the pieces that you currently report in NPIs as they stand. So for example, the number and hours of board members in capacity building activities, agency staff and volunteer staff, this would be reflected in what you currently know as NPI 5.1, which is really getting at the agency capacity to provide services to strengthen assessments, to strengthen the input and role of that tripartite board. And similarly, we talk about certification and staff development, and you'll see here with ROMA trainers, the newly launched ROMA implementers, CCAPs, and other additional certifications. And we've added these in because we know that these are not administrative expenditures, but more agency capacity building. And we really want to pursue a strong network. And so we understand that in order to address the complexity of poverty and really engage and maximize the involvement of our staff and our volunteer board members, we want to be able to capture and reflect CSBG is a critical element in allowing our agencies to be that strong, high-performing, foundational piece on the theory of change.
And Rae, before you go off of this slide, I do want to talk about some of the feedback that we've already received from the network, which has been wonderful feedback, has been that under, for example, the staff development and certification attainment, we don't have everything that's in a community action agency. We're missing some critical areas, such as the weatherization, QCI, and some other areas that we're looking at adding. So those are the things that we want you to really pay attention to and let us know. We also had, Tiffany just brought up today that she would like to be able to talk about the hours of agency capacity of board members and of staff that have been trained that may not have been directly funded by CSBG. And so that's a really good point for us to look at and to see that, yes, we want to know the core activities funded by CSBG, but that because this was part of the NPIs that allows you to talk about everything that your agency does, I think that's important for us to look at possibly having another column here that says, and any other activities not funded by CSBG. So those are the kinds of things that we really do want you to let us know as you go through and you review these, some of the questions that you have, because we've been looking at these, and sometimes you miss the forest for the trees. So, okay, we'll go back on.
Thanks, Jenae. I see some questions coming in, and we'll be sure to tackle those at the end. I do want to move to the resources of the CSBG network. And again, for those who are familiar with the CSBG IS, this is the current Section F. And this is, if you've been tracking the ROMA Components Guide, you will see that this is the first form that would be reported on in the earliest time period. And this is because it is the same as Section F. There has been one change to the entire Section F form, and that is to add in the total number of hours donated by volunteers and the total number of hours donated by volunteers with low incomes. And this, again, this is a piece of data that you are collecting now. This is 2.3 and 3.1 for those who have memorized the NPI forms. And the reason that we've placed it into resources administered is I will again direct you back to the theory of change. Our emphasis is on leveraging state, federal, and community resources. And so we want to have within our resources, which is the total agency-wide allocated capacity to use its resources to the best possible strategies and services. We want to know what kinds of hours of volunteer do you have at your resource level, and how does that translate into our leveraging dollars? So for those who have seen the fact sheets that NASCSP puts out and those that are produced within the current CSBG IS, this is what helps us really tell the story of the value of CSBG. Of each funding dollar, we know what kinds of federal, state, local, private, and volunteer resources that we have leveraged. And so this is the only change to Section F, is the addition of the value of the volunteer hours. And that will be auto-calculated, but that is the only change. So I did want to make sure that everyone was aware that this form is the same as Section F with that singular addition.
And for those of you who are familiar with the IS going back a few years ago, we used to ask for the volunteer hours in Section F as well as the NPIs. And so there was confusion because we would get different hours. Some of the thought process of moving it back here is exactly what Rae said. We wanted to talk about all the resources, and we know that if people are donating their time to your agency, that there is a monetary value of that. One of the concerns that we had at a previous webinar is that their fiscal people would not know what hours to put in here. And I want to point out that these are all end reports, that however you collect the information to generate this, that's what will then go in here, that we're not asking for a fiscal person to hunt down the volunteer hours, that we're asking for you to have a system to be able to collect that information, and then when it's needed to be turned into your state and the state to NASCSP, that you know where the data lives. And so the volunteer hours is in this resource administrative section.
Thanks. So I do want to follow up on what Jenae has mentioned already, is that we do realize, having heard some feedback already from the network, that there may be pieces that you would like to see added or clarified with these two reporting forms. And so we have launched a survey specifically related to CSBG expenditures and resources. And this will focus on the categories for reporting the CSBG expenditures and the agency capacity, as well as the agency level resources. And these, this is survey 4 for those of you who are looking on the ROMA Next Gen page. And this will also this is also posted in a Word document and a PDF form to allow you to get a sense of which kinds of pieces we'll be asking, and for you to organize your thoughts prior to filling out that survey. And so for many of you, some of the questions that I'm seeing coming in on the chat would be very valuable for you to include as well in this survey. And so this survey is going to be asking questions like, how well do the domains for reporting expenditures allow you to describe your expenditures? And this would be from very well to not very well at all. How does this allow you to identify your agency capacity building activities? How does this demonstrate your support for board members, staff, and volunteers? How does this reflect your staff qualifications that demonstrate increased investment in agency capacity? And then how well do the categories for recording resources allow you to describe the total resources that are available to you at your agency's operating level? And I think with that, I will turn it over to Kate.
Hi, this is Kate Blunt. I've been working with OCS and NASCSP for the last year or so on the ROMA Next Generation. And I want to take you back a little bit to where Jenae was talking about, hey, where do we want the network to be? What is ROMA Next Generation? And how we tie outcomes, services, and people together. And I'm sure you've heard from previous webinars that we view ROMA Next Generation from a couple different perspectives. Primarily, we're thinking that this is a system for continuous improvement for us to increase impact, for us to improve our services and our strategies. We're thinking this is a lot less about reporting for reporting's sake. Yes, there'll be an annual report, but we're hoping that the data that's collected will be able to be used by the network, by the local agencies, by the state on an ongoing basis, not just on an annual basis, to do analysis and to continually improve how we operate and what impact that we have. This will mean trying to tie together and being able to integrate the information about the people that we're serving, the services and the strategies that were provided, and the outcomes that are achieved. Because we want a better understanding of what services produce the best outcomes for specific populations, family types, and communities. We got to be able to link these things together, one, to be able to better manage it, but to also to be able to better tell our story. We've given you some examples of what we are talking about on the next slide in terms of outcomes, services, and people at the individual and family level. So when you look at the outcomes, for instance, we're talking about, and you heard this in the webinar last week, examples are obtaining jobs, completed education, increased income, improved parenting, secured housing. Those are all some of the MPIs. To get to those MPIs, we're going to deliver some services. We're going to provide job training, work experience, scholarships, financial education, support groups, housing counseling, all those kinds of things that are part of that list of services, which I'm sure you're all combing over and refining for us. Then finally, we need to know who's getting these services and who are we expecting to achieve an outcome. And that's that unduplicated count of people served. We have two reports, as you'll recall, all the participant characteristics for everybody that we serve in a year, and then what are the participants that come into us that year? What's the baseline? What do they look like when they come to us so that we can understand the people that we're serving? What we try to do with ROMA Next Generation is to encourage analysis of the data that will produce questions that the local, state, and national level can ask and answer to improve management, impact, and accountability. For instance, we may know that 50 out of 80 program participants, or 62%, have achieved the outcome. The question is that a good percent? Is there a difference in the demographic profile between those who achieved a job and those who didn't? Another question might be, is there a difference in the intensity or frequency of the service? Did they attend more sessions than others? Did they get different services or more services than some others that didn't achieve the outcome? So we're hoping that this use of data, the analysis of the data, will raise questions that we can then pursue in terms of answering and improving our services. The next slide does the same thing in terms of the community level, lays out some of the outcome strategies and community data. That's the kind of data you'll be using to ask the same kinds of questions. What impact are we achieving? Are our strategies working? Who's benefiting? Do we need to change anything? All of this is sort of a lead up into what's the analysis, kind of more of a deeper dive into what's the analysis that we're hoping will come out of the collection of the kind of data that we're talking about in these reports. And let me turn it back over to Rae.
Thanks, Kate. So we really want to know what the data means. We all know that it's possible to produce mountains of data and then look at it and file it somewhere and forget about it until the next reporting period. And we really want ROMA Next Generation to be a useful set of indicators and a useful set of data to allow you to analyze and understand your data and what it actually means and how it's useful to shape and guide your strategies, your services, and the outcomes that you're achieving. So we understand that we need additional information to tell the community action story, and we're hopeful that this additional information is useful at the local, state, and national level. We want to know what our participants look like when they come to us before they receive services from a community action agency. So, for example, it doesn't do us as much benefit to know at the end of the year someone's income level if we don't know where they started when they came in. If we know that the majority of our agency level clients are being served and coming in with a need at under 50% of the federal poverty guidelines, that is a whole different understanding of the range of services and the depth of services that would be essential to moving people towards self-sufficiency and economic security, as opposed to someone who comes in at a higher level, for example. And so we also want to know, is our population being served predominantly elderly? Is it predominantly youth? This will help us look at our outcomes and the services and the strategies and the programs and ask ourselves, is our range of services geared towards the population that comes through our doors? Because if we have job creation services and they're being underutilized either through the participants that are coming through the door, or perhaps our demographics have shifted over the years as our population and our community has evolved, we need to know this so that we can adjust our offerings to meet our community needs. Likewise, we also want to know who does a community action agency serve in a program year. And so you'll see when you look at the two reports that the baseline and the all have pretty much identical demographic and characteristic information. But just as we want to know what people look like when they come to us, we also want to be able to say how many people's lives were impacted by community action agencies. And so we understand that not everyone will be a new person coming through, and we also know that at the end of the year, the wide range of services and programs that we run at community action agencies touch thousands of lives every year. And so we want to also know how many people and households are served in a program year so that we can tell that story and really showcase that we are changing this many lives through this many resources, tying it back to our resources. So we want to be able to say these two different pieces. And in the current CSBGIS, these two pieces were tied in one report. So the people so at the beginning and at the end of the program year, we understand that these are two different snapshots of the community action story, and we really wanted to be able to pull those two pictures out so that when we talk about the impact of community action agencies, we'll be able to say who people look like and what they look like at the end or after they've been engaged with us over a period of time. Similarly, we also really want to know who is receiving services during a reporting year and who achieves outcomes. So we understand that oftentimes, for example, to achieve an outcome, a person may receive multiple services. And so we really want to be able to position the community action story to showcase the broad range of supportive efforts that are done at a local level to achieve an outcome. So not only do we want to know how somebody's life was changed as a result of community action, but we also want to know what kinds of services and what kinds of programs were essential to achieving that outcome. Many of you have heard us talk about bundled services over the years, and we want to really make sure that we're in a position to be able to showcase the importance of multiple services to achieve a singular outcome in a single person's life. And so we have this community action story in brief. And this sort of sums up what I've sort of said over the course of this presentation, which is that we really want to, at the end of the day, be able to say that community action achieved results or changes in the lives of families, individuals, and communities by delivering or implementing a certain set of services or strategies using a specific amount of resources and leveraged capacity. And I think I will turn it back over to Jenae to discuss more about how this builds on the ROMA 1.0.
Thank you, Rae. So this slide should be very familiar to most of you. This is the results-oriented management and accountability cycle. This talks about what ROMA really should be. And as I said before, it's not about just reporting. That ROMA really starts with the assessment. It's your community needs assessment. It's your planning for how you're going to use your resources and what your agency is going to do. So it's how does your agency fit into what your community needs? What under your agency mission can you really do? What can you implement? What strategies can you really have to impact your communities? So then it's your implementation. Those are your services and your strategies to produce your results. And then after you implement, and periodically as you're implementing them, so you wouldn't wait until the end of the year, that you would check in to see what are your achievement of results. And that means that you would be setting targets for what you are going to be doing. You know, this is how many people we expect to serve in our agency this year. This is how many we are going to help them with employment, if you have employment, through Head Start, through nutrition programs. And then see, you know, did you meet your target? And if not, why not? And that's the evaluation part. So as I said, this is all pretty familiar, but we wanted to put it into a bit of a different format for you to see, especially as we start talking about performance management. That on this slide, we have our community action goals that we had identified. So the 3 new national goals that are proposed. And then we talk about the needs assessment. And we go deep into a deeper dive on the needs assessment, that we really want you to look at what are the major causes and conditions of poverty that face individuals and families within your communities, and what can you do to impact that. We know, again, that poverty is very complex and that you're not going to be able to do everything. But what is your role as a community action agency, and what can you do? So then what services do you need to be able to provide? What partnerships do you need? You know, if you're in a large urban area, you may not be the only provider out there. So you don't have to do all of the emergency services if somebody else can do that. You want to be able to have a partnership with them, though, so that you can be able to refer people there and that they can do the same. What are the strategies that you need to be working on in your community? You know, do you need to be able to go after new grant resources? Do you need to talk about how challenging it is to be a small rural provider and being the only shop in town? You know, what kind of data do you need to be able to collect to talk about how do we make a difference? How can we improve our programs? How can we go after those additional funding sources? And then the implementation. You know, who are our resources, our people resources in our community action agency that can help us be able to provide these individual and family resources, these community implementation changes that we want to make. Those are our volunteers, those are our staff. And then as Rae said, it's about the data that's collected and looking at that, the demographics of the people served, the services provided, and the MPIs. So taking this a bit further, for the local data, that at the local level, you really do want to talk about what difference did you make and what kind of program improvements can you do to really enhance your impact. So when you look at the analysis of demographic data, you'll look at not only who you served, as Rae said, and what they looked at when they first came into your agency, but also, you know, what are their different levels of employment or education status? What does the data tell you? We have some agencies that have some sophisticated systems out there that they've also been able to do a target analysis on where people live who are accessing their services, that they may cover 5 counties, and they wanted to ensure that they were having equal services distributed between the 5 counties. But with their new systems, that they were able to tell that predominantly they were only providing services to 2 counties. So they were able to then change their process and open up satellite offices to cover those other 3 counties. That's the power of data. Now, when I entered into the network back in 1999, we still had some pretty simplistic data systems out there. That when I did my first Section G demographic report, I was cutting and pasting, trying to find the unduplicated count. We're now in 2016, and we know that systems have changed greatly, but we also need to ensure that we're working with those level of agencies to be able to get those systems out there. So many of the questions that you have come through our chat function today is talking about what systems are out there. That what we're proposing here with ROMA Next Generation is the end result, but that we know that there's a lot of vendors out there who provide systems to be able to do this. We know that there are states that have developed systems to be able to collect this information. That discussion, the IT discussion, is valuable because we need to be able to have these kinds of tools at your service to be able to do this analysis. But you can still do this kind of analysis even if you're using Excel spreadsheets. It's not ideal, but it is very doable. So when we look at the analysis of the NPI data, the National Performance Indicators, we also want to talk about the basis for success. So when we talk about how you look at your data and which individuals achieve particular outcomes, we're not giving you a specific path to do that. We're letting you be able to decide that because we don't want to tell you that these core bundled services from a national perspective lead to this outcome because it's going to change depending on your own local needs. Your local area could have needs that are totally different than others, but you should know what that story is. You should be able to say that you saw a spike in your employment numbers because you were able to offer bus tokens that led to secure transportation and that was a really good strategy for your area. These are the conversations that you should be having at your board level, at your staff meetings, and in your community as a whole. So continuing on this local analysis of the service data, what type of services did we deliver? Are you offering Head Start services? Are you offering nutrition services, employment services, education services? How many people receive those services? And if you've been part of any of our ROMA training, we also talk about, what was your success rate? That we discuss the fact that, again, poverty is very complex, that you're not going to have 100 people who are homeless secure permanent housing within a year, typically. That 100% success rate doesn't happen, that there's multiple levels that you need to work with people to be able to do this. And so you want to know what strategies are really successful and how long does that take. We use the baseball method, that baseball can say that at 300 batting average can be paid millions, even though that's only 30% because they had the data and the statistics to talk about that was a great success. That's the same story that we have been building on and we need to continue to build upon. That the community strategies that we're engaged with, we really do focus on the individuals and the families because that's the core of what we do. But we also need to talk about the community as a whole, that you're not going to be able to secure employment if there's no employment opportunities in your community. So what are those community strategies to be able to bring jobs there? We know community action isn't going to be the only player there, that you may have a small part of that, but those are the conversations that you should be having, and that's how you should be using this data to tell your story. At the state level, at the state, when you receive the information from your local agencies, you do really look at it to see, is it accurate, is it reliable? Going back to an embarrassing story for me, the very first time that I worked for a community action agency, I pulled together the weatherization, Head Start, nutrition programs into one report, and we showed more people than actually lived in the area because we didn't have a way of doing unduplicated counts. And that we were then able to tell that when an individual and family came to our community action agency, they usually accessed about 5 different services, and those were in 5 different systems. So we know that this is an issue, and we know that there have been some really great strides made at local agencies, at states, to be able to get that unduplicated count so that you can really tell what that impact is in everybody that you're receiving services in your area, where they're leading to, what strategies they've been able to be implemented, and what outcomes they've been able to then access. So we want to talk about, what types of services are provided throughout your state, how are they accessed, what are the national performance indicators, what are the success rates, how well does the local agency know their own programs, or are they able to target for their own success? What service delivery models appear most effective, what local agencies have best practices that could be replicated in other parts of the states. So now I'm going to turn this back over to Rae to talk about collecting feedback in the surveys.
Thanks, Jenae. I actually want to go ahead and do a quick poll of those on the on the webinar to get a really fast sense of the ability of agencies to achieve an unduplicated count. And this is going to be directly related to the distinct areas in which we're focused on an unduplicated count. So, for example, we asked about unduplicated counts as related to individuals and families, but we also ask about unduplicated outcomes or unduplicated services and outcomes and strategies. So we're really curious on whether or not, and this is just a quick snapshot, and if any of these also jogs your thoughts or you feel that this is something that you could possibly answer in the future through the ROMA Next Generation, our hope is that these polling questions are also going to help you think about the vision that we have for understanding and using our data. And so I'm just going to give us a few minutes to look over this poll, and to keep in mind that even if you answer no or yes now, the idea here is that ROMA Next Generation is intended to move us towards these pieces.
And Rae, as folks are completing the survey, I do want to remind participants that there are 4 questions, a series of questions that we're asking, and we'd greatly appreciate your response to all 4 of those questions. And as usual, we do understand that we have a mix of folks on this webinar, so for some, responding to this question may not seem appropriate, but for all of those local agencies, certainly we hope that you would respond so we can get a better feel, as Rae noted, of where things stand and where we need to go, and where training and technical assistance needs to be focused.
So we also really want to make sure that for those who are at the state or state association or national level on this webinar, to really be able to to see what types of analysis and connections we are hoping to get out of ROMA Next Generation. And we understand that there is no option to choose no, because our hope is that ROMA Next Generation will allow you to do this analysis.
Thanks, Rae. So we're going to give it a few more minutes. It looks like we still have some responses coming in, but it looks like they might be slowing down a bit.
And this conversation about the system's needs and what is currently out there, being able to provide best practice models, being able to talk about what's going to be needed to be able to do this is going to be an ongoing dialogue. That this initial comment period is just looking at the data points that we're proposing to go into the federal system, but we know that there's going to be years of dialogue and training technical assistance around the whole systems process, and that part of that needs to be talking about, how do we get our partners to work better together, that we have Head Start and community action agencies, and Head Start doesn't necessarily share the information all the time, and so can we get a memorandum of understanding from the National Head Start Federal Office and OCS to talk about those. So those are the kinds of barriers that we are aware of and that we're trying to help reduce at the national and federal level, but we know there's also state and local challenges that we want to be able to assist you with as well.
So we're going to go ahead. It looks like the responses have begun to slow down. We're going to go ahead and close the poll, and shortly we should be able to share with you the results. Okay, and hopefully folks are able to see at this time the results of the polling.
Great, thank you, Jovita. So as you can see, some of the no answers may have been, again, the different levels of folks who are participating on this webinar, and we also understand that at this time the capacity may not be there, but we are very encouraged to see that many of you do conduct this analysis at the current time, and that many of you seem to share the hope that ROMA Next Generation will allow you to do these kinds of analyses and connect these dots. So with the survey, the final survey is focused really on the connections between these components of ROMA Next Generation. So somewhat similar to this quick polling question, you'll be asked about the broad characteristics of each component of ROMA Next Generation and how you might use the data from each component. It will ask about your capacity to capture and analyze the data elements now, whether you would like to have this capacity, and whether your capacity is dependent on a data system. For example, we understand there are data capacity issues, but we are mostly focused at this moment on the data elements. So the systems and the capacity we realize will be there and will require training. But we want to make sure that we are currently asking the right questions for ROMA Next Generation. I want to note that surveys 3 and 4 provide an opportunity for you or a member of your staff to provide detailed feedback on the individual elements of the components, but this survey is going to ask you sort of your broad reaction to the components of ROMA Next Generation as a whole. So how well does the indicator set allow you to describe the impact of the work that you do? How well do the services as a whole allow you to describe the work that you do to provide services to individuals and families, for example? So again, there are 5 surveys, and our hope is that 1 through 4 will allow you to comment in specific on various pieces within these broad buckets of component elements. But the final survey is really our intent here is to capture your overall reaction to the components that we're proposing and to provide additional detail on your capacity to analyze and capture the connections between each of these pieces. So I believe we have one final polling question to ask, and at the same time as you are all responding to the poll, we'll be going ahead on our end and taking a moment to go through the questions that have come in. We've seen a lot of activity on our chat, and we want to make sure that we've captured all of your questions and are organized to respond as efficiently in these last few minutes of the webinar. So I'm going to ask Jovita to go ahead and launch that final poll while the panelists take a few moments to get a handle on all of the questions that have come in.
So once again, this final poll is a series of questions. You do have 4 questions to respond to, and we have a multiple choice. You can only enter one answer, or you can choose not to answer. But this is really about the overall piece, making the connections, ROMA Next Gen overall, where we're headed, what we'd like to do. So it looks like folks are responding, so thank you for that. And once again, we do understand that this survey may be more applicable to local agencies, but as Rae mentioned, if you're an association or a state and you'd like to enter a response based on the collective, how you feel folks will fare in your state, we'd appreciate that as well. And also we see some additional questions coming in via the chat function. Feel free, if you have not already and you're looking through today's PowerPoint or you're thinking about this current polling, if you do have a question you'd like to submit, feel free to do that via the chat function. And if we're able to make it through those questions that we have already received, we'll be certain to respond to your question as well. And if not, please be aware that, once again, we are creating a frequently asked questions document that's in the final stages, which is a compilation of the high-level questions that have been asked over the course of the webinar series. And we'll be posting that to the NASCSP website. And we'll certainly send out a e-blast to make folks aware when it is posted. And it looks like responses are beginning to slow down, but I'm going to give it a few more minutes. Once again, if you can provide some feedback, maybe you can answer 1 or 2, but not all of the questions, we greatly appreciate it. Excellent. It looks like we have some more movement in terms of those who are completing the survey. Okay, we'll give folks a bit of a warning, and maybe we'll shut it down in maybe maybe about 30 seconds or so. I do see some additional movement, and do want to encourage those who haven't participated yet to do so to some, if not all, of the questions. And I would like to take this opportunity also to note that if you were not able to join us for all of the webinars, each one has been posted to the NASCSP website, and this webinar will be posted as well shortly after we conclude today and we're able to translate it to an appropriate format. So feel free to download those webinars and listen to them at your leisure. Feel free to share them with your colleagues, other practitioners, consultants within the network. Feel free to listen to them before, while you're doing or completing the surveys, 1 through 5. They're there to help, to be of an assistance as you're completing the surveys and thinking through the ROMA Next Generation components. So we're going to go ahead and close the poll. And it looks like we have a few last-minute results coming in. Also, I do want to note that, unfortunately, Jenae Bjelland from OCS was unable to join us, but we do want to thank OCS for their support and leadership throughout the ROMA Next Generation process, and they were able to participate with us on a number of the early webinars, so we're greatly appreciative of their efforts and leadership. Okay. So folks should be able to see the polling results. And while we did get a number of responses, we also have a number of folks who provided no answer. So I think at this point we're ready to go ahead and tackle the Q&A portion, so I'll turn it back over to the presentation team.
Great. Thank you, Jovita. So I want to go ahead and address a couple of questions that are more logistical. So with regards to the slides and the recording, the PowerPoint slides are currently posted on the website, and this recording will be posted for your review as well. With regards to a question on when is it planned to roll out the ROMA Next Generation reporting, I again encourage you to go to the ROMA Next Gen Components Guide, and on the final column you'll be able to see a proposed timeline, and that should give you a quick and broad sense of the various fiscal years in which this rollout is intended to be implemented and then reported on. Many of the questions that have come in have been around the expenditures report and the differences between administration and agency capacity. So I want to encourage all of us on this webinar to refer back to IM 37 and also to realize that this is a work in progress and that NASCSP and OCS will be, once the data elements are refined, NASCSP and OCS will be working to put out additional guidance on the differences between administration and agency capacity. And so we understand that some may appear to be duplicative, and we would welcome your feedback on which elements you think may be the most difficult for you to track or to report on with regards to the difference between these two expenditure categories.
One of the examples that we received is that a reason why we put agency capacity here separate from administration is that we don't have an agency national goal anymore, but it's still very important to build the capacity within our own agency, and that we wanted to show that CSBG funds could be used for that. And so it could be that we have administration be a core line and then agency capacity is a subcategory of that. But I do want to reiterate what Rae was saying, that we're taking all of your feedback and we're looking at this to try to clarify, make sense, and be able to provide information on what this really means. And for those of you who aren't familiar with IM 37, it talks about administration in a different way than many programs do. That if you're paying for programmatic staff salary out of CSBG, that's program, not admin. That the only thing that you really truly classify as admin is things that are indirect costs that you can't attribute to a specific program. So we have local agencies out there who actually don't report anything in administration because everything they're doing reflects to a program.
Thanks, Jenae. We also have a question with regards to the resources, the proposed resources change, questioning why the volunteer hours would be calculated at minimum wage. And this is not something that is set in stone. This could be something that we maintain as just an hour count, or if you feel strongly about a particular value that would be used. So at the current status of this hourly report is that it is translated at both federal minimum wage, state minimum wage, and at the independent sector value. And so these are different ways to talk about and discuss the value of the volunteer dollar. And so if you have specific feedback, again, I would direct you to Survey 4 to really focus us in and be able to assess if, in fact, minimum wage is not the appropriate calculation that you feel reflects the full resources that are leveraged for you at the agency level. We do encourage you to give us that feedback, and we can modify that calculation. What we do. Yep.
Right. A little history on that is that we have had extensive conversations about what do we calculate to volunteers, because we know that we have accountants, we have lawyers who are providing volunteer hours. The reason why we've chosen the minimum wage is that it's the lowest denominator that we can have, and that still shows a massive amount of leveraged funds out there. And so when we talk about it, we use that as our baseline, but then we also use independent sector and some other calculations. So we're not saying for you to change your own way of doing this, that we didn't want it to be said on the Hill, that when we go talk about this with Congress, that we were trying to inflate our numbers. We were trying to use what was the lowest to show what that means across the board, and then also talk about the fact that we know that there are higher wages out there that we can use to calculate this, and that this is what it would look like if we use independent sector in some other areas.
Thanks, Jenae. We also have a question on why the expenditures are not perfectly aligned with the domains that we have proposed. And I'll go ahead and take the first answer to that, and Jenae, if you'd like to chime in as well. So we have attempted to align the expenditures with the domains in some capacities while also maintaining a connection to the statutory language and the connection to the original language that sets out the CSBG Act. So nutrition, for example, would be in that language. And then with regards to emergency services and coordinated service delivery, as well as linkages. Linkages would be, for example, where we would see the majority of those strategies that you're implementing at the community level. So we didn't necessarily want those specific funding dollars to be reported within a single category if, in fact, it is a multi-domain focus. Likewise, with the coordinated service delivery, this was getting at the fact that we are also asking about services as well as outcomes, and oftentimes CSBG funding is used to support case management or those community linkages type of work, as well as emergency services. And the emergency services, the coordinated service delivery, and the linkages have been integrated into our outcomes language. So we understand that the services that are implemented under those emergency services CSBG expenditures would be related to distinct outcomes on our NPI report. And so they do not match up perfectly in that we understand that monetarily expenditures are not directly going to be related all the time to services, strategies, or outcomes. So we do have a question, Jenae, on what systems have been developed to track such participant demographics, or are agencies expected to develop these tracking systems on their own?
As I mentioned before, we know that there's a lot of different systems out there, that there are HMIS systems that are also looking at CSBG data, and that there are a lot of vendors that are looking at community action as a whole to be able to collect CSBG, Head Start, HMIS, weatherization, LIHEAP. We at NASCSP, we don't endorse any vendor out there, but we do collect information on what different vendors are being used throughout the states and the local agencies. And one of the things that we had started to work with the Community Action Partnership at the national level was to be able to develop a data dictionary that all software systems to then match to. That we know that you have multiple systems in agencies that I think on average it's about 5 to 7 different systems that you have to enter information into, which is a massive challenge that we need to talk about. But that there are ways that local agencies and states have been using their TNTA money, their discretionary money, and some of their admin money to be able to fund these changes and these upgrades. In fact, in the President's budget for 2017, there was language in there that talked about the fact that if approved, that the states could modify how they use some of their admin and discretionary funds to be able to help supplement the development of TNTA IT systems out there. So this is a continuing conversation that we're having. We know that it is a challenge. It's not something that I can give you an easy answer to, but just know that we are aware of it and that we're working with all of you and with the federal partners to talk about what can be done to address this.
Thank you, Jenae.
We get another question about what will be the role of the certified ROMA trainers to help agencies through all of this. Many of them cannot achieve success without assistance from a ROMA expert. We understand this. Barbara Mooney, unfortunately, couldn't be here today. She's been on all the webinars and has fully participated in all of this. In fact, we held a special webinar for the ROMA trainers last week, or maybe it was the week before last. But yes, we expect the ROMA trainers, just as they have with ROMA 1.0, to be able to represent ROMA Next Generation to help with not only understanding the reporting requirements, but understanding the analysis piece. So yes, we'll be providing that training, then the ROMA trainers will be providing training, so that's something we can expect. Fortunately, as you will see from the components guide, much of this isn't going to be rolled out for a couple of years. So we have time to do some training, to develop some systems. This isn't something we're going to try to do tomorrow. But we know there's a lot of work, but we've got to get this this baseline stuff done so that we can proceed to actually do the nuts and bolts of it. What other questions here?
I just want to take a second to really reiterate what Kate just said. So the idea with the ROMA Next Generation initial comment period is really to get a sense of whether or not the data elements themselves will help you as an agency and as a state to tell the community action story in a stronger and more robust way with more nuances than perhaps is able with the current CSBG IS. The nuts and bolts, as Kate mentioned, we will address those later, and we will begin to become more engaged with the data systems and data capacity elements once we know which pieces we're actually going to be collecting. So we can't necessarily start to build the wagon before the horse. We really want to know these pieces so that we can get a sense of where we are and where we need to be in terms of capacity later down the road. I also want to follow up on Kate's answer on the ROMA trainers. I know that Barbara Mooney, many of you are familiar with Barbara Mooney, and I know that she is going to be rolling out an update to the ROMA certification process. As you may have seen on the agency capacity and expenditures report, Barbara will be sending out much more detail, and I expect that it will also be addressed at the in-service in April. But there will be ROMA trainers and ROMA implementers now, and this will be an additional training that will be less I'm not 100% sure how it's going to work. This would be a question for Barbara, and unfortunately she is not here with us. However, there will be sort of 3 tiers of ROMA training. One will be how to do it at the agency, and the others will be training with different focuses to allow agencies to have someone on staff who is focused on implementing ROMA as opposed to training others to implement ROMA. So I would watch for more information forthcoming from Barbara on this new rollout of a ROMA implementer to assist the network with understanding the connections between ROMA Next Generation and ROMA 1.0, and also how to actually analyze and use the data and not just as a reporting tool.
The biggest difference with the ROMA implementer and the ROMA trainer is that the ROMA trainers are required to hold a certain number of trainings each year as certified trainers. And so the implementers aren't required to do that, but they are the go-to source at the state, local, regional level to be able to help local agencies understand what ROMA is, talk about how it fits in with their community needs assessment, their strategic plan, discuss how it even fits in with the org standards. And so I think that it's a really invaluable resource to be able to have. I am a ROMA certified trainer. Rae and Lauren on staff, our staff are going through the process right now, as well as the partnership staff. So what other questions do we have, Rae?
It looks like we've gotten a couple more questions on where to go to find the surveys. And I would again reference us back to the ROMA Next Gen Components Guide, and I believe that Jovita has shared that link with us in the chat window. We will also be publishing shortly discussion guides to help support those of you who have indicated that you would like to work together within your agency or across your state to really help frame the understanding of the various components within ROMA Next Generation. And so I would encourage you to both watch for the forthcoming discussion guides, but also to download the surveys in their PDF or Word form, since the surveys themselves are built to walk you through the intention and purpose behind each component and element and indicator within our new proposals to really help set the stage for why we've made these changes and our intention behind the new version of the data collection.
And just to remind everyone, this is the initial comment period before the official OMB comment period. In that will be a 60-day comment period, and then after that, there's a 30-day comment period before any of this is made into actual federal requirements. So there is time, but we want to ensure that we get all of the comments that we can during this initial comment period so that we can make those refinements, and we can ensure that by the time we get to the OMB processes, people are very familiar with what's going to be collected, why it's going to be collected, and what the timing is going to be.
The initial comment period goes through April 1st, next Friday. So we're encouraging everybody to try to get everything done by then to give us enough time to really review and to refine and modify based on the input that we get.
I think that's everything for now, yeah. And so any questions that we didn't get to, we will be looking at how to address them in our frequently asked questions that will be posted to our website. You can always reach us as well by sending your questions to our Gmail account. Rae, can you send the Gmail account to all the participants so that they can know how to send us information? And that the timelines for implementation, you can see those on the component guides that we have for each one of the different levels. We talk about when it would be collected, when it's projected to be collected. And then because each state has their own program year, we even give a link to you to be able to figure out what your state CSBG program year is. So thank you everyone for joining us. We look forward to hearing from you. Don't hesitate to contact us if you have any further questions, and keep your eye out for more information coming from NASCSP for the ROMA Next Generation process.